For Session Update, I'm Shannon Loehrke. Recently, both the Senate DFL caucus and the Senate Republican caucus held press conferences to talk about their 2016 legislative priorities on education. I had the chance to speak with leaders from both parties. Joining me in the studio to talk about the DFL perspective is Chair of the Senate Education Committee, Senator Chuck Wiger. Welcome, Senator Wiger.
Thank you very much.
So your committee recently heard testimony about the teacher shortage in Minnesota. What does your caucus propose to do about that shortage?
Number of things. We have a crisis in Minnesota in terms of the amount of teachers that are available in the classroom. We propose several things. First, we need to provide incentives for people to become teachers. That could be a financial incentive, it could be grants, forgiveness and loans, or a couple of the ideas that we have in our finance bill. We will have suggestions for encouraging paraprofessionals to become teachers as well, a pathway for paras. Additionally, the red tape involved for many teachers that have a license already, perhaps they're from another state that want to teach here. The Office of the Legislative Auditor did a comprehensive report and said we need a sweeping overhaul of the licensing system. And we're going to do that. We're going to have a 12-member bipartisan group that's going to come up with a number of recommendations as suggested by the Legislative Auditor for the upcoming session. So there's financial incentives, there's also some streamlining of the process and other areas, but those would be some of the highlights to address the teacher shortage. Right now, math, science, special education teachers, big shortage. Also for agriculture, career vocational ed. There's over 3,000 of the 58,000 teachers that we have that don't have a full license, and we need to address this. This is very important to provide quality opportunities for our students, to prepare students for the world's best workforce. So, huge priority, and we have a number of proposals to address that.
What about alternative pathways to licensure for people who want to make a career change?
Yes, we encourage that, and you need to have the background, and you know, a couple of key things to be a successful teacher is your knowledge of the subject, and then ultimately your ability to connect with students. And the Board of Teaching has a process for doing that. We've encouraged that, and the Way to Grow legislation that we will have in our ultimate finance bill, I'm hoping that'll provide a pathway as well. But we need to provide a lot of additional opportunities for highly motivated, qualified applicants, and that's going to help address the teacher shortage.
So in the press conference, there was mention of QComp and expanding QComp. Can you first explain what QComp is and then also talk about why it should be expanded?
Yes, QComp refers to rewarding teachers for quality performance. And
so is it an incentive program essentially?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And actually, former Governor Pawlenty, it was one of the initiatives that he brought forward, and as it rolled out into many of the districts in the state through a lot of discussion, that if you provide adequate training and involve teachers, that the opportunity has been embraced by many. In fact, there's a waiting list now for people wanting to get the additional funds for QComp districts, and we have said we should level the playing field so that all districts are eligible for QComp. So I want to commend Governor Pawlenty for the initiative that he had back then. It's been embraced on a bipartisan basis, and particularly a number of rural districts would like to see this. The training and development is a key part of having the world's best workforce trained by teachers that have had the opportunity to have successful training, and the QComp works very closely with that goal. So we'd like to see the cap. Right now there's a cap on how many districts are eligible to get it. Districts want to get on this. It's just a matter of we don't have enough funds. Okay. We will have additional incentives for districts to participate. Also, I want to thank Senator Leroy Stump for his leadership on this area, and it is a high priority.
At the press conference, there was also mention of continuing teacher development. Why is developmental programs for teachers continuing on? Why is that important?
Getting training and development for all people, whatever your profession, your skill set might be. If you're an electrician, a plumber, a doctor, a lawyer, you need to have an ongoing program to develop your skills. And we do have staff development funds that are available now, but when we rolled out the evaluation law a few years ago, ultimately on a bipartisan basis, it set in motion a comprehensive evaluation system for teachers and principals. Again, it's a part of our goal to have the world's best workforce. You need to have great teachers. Great teachers need the tools, the additional training and development to get them there. And so this has been a top priority, concern expressed by teachers that say, yes, we want to improve, but to get those tools, we need to provide the training to do that, just as you would want to get additional training for perfecting your skills, your craft. So it's a priority, and not only have the teachers asked for this, the school boards as well. So it's a priority. That's why we called that out in our earlier announcement of priorities.
Okay. You've mentioned it several times now, the world's best workforce. I just heard about it, I think the first time about a month ago. Can you talk about what that is, what that means for Minnesota schools?
Yes, it means we are competing in a global marketplace, and we in Minnesota want to send a very strong signal to the world that we're preparing the world's best workers. We have a number of benchmarks that we use to see how we're doing. The first one, are students ready for kindergarten? And if they are ready for kindergarten, they're very likely to ultimately graduate.
Sure.
And if not, it could spell a need for additional remediation programs. So big emphasis for world's best workforce in the benchmark that you're ready for K.
So does this involve preschool?
Yes.
Okay.
We have a number of programs in early education, and I can expand on that, but on the world's best workforce, the first benchmark is ready for K. Then we have another benchmark, and that's our students proficiently reading at the end of third grade, a key milestone in that journey. And then we ask ultimately, did the student graduate? We have just over 80% now that are graduating. We want 100%. And when we say graduate, we also mean, are they college and or career ready? And so those basic benchmarks are in the world's best workforce. We also ask districts to report on what's being done to close the achievement gap so that all students are lifted up in this formula, which ultimately has the goal for those students competing for jobs that they're going to be college and or career ready. That's what the world's best workforce is all about. And I want to pay tribute to Representative Paul Marquardt, who led the charge in the House, and we embraced that in conference committee on a number of these goals. And now it's a key part of our accountability for the education system of Minnesota.
So making sure that all third graders can read at grade level.
Yes.
Is there a system in place for those who can't, so that they get brought up to that third grade reading level? How does that exactly work?
Okay. Well, right now we have proficiency tests, and through the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment, and it starts third grade, and it goes, they're mandatory third through eighth, and there's another one at the secondary level, but reading is so important. And the majority of students are reading proficiently, and you can actually find out for each school or charter school, each public or charter school in the state, you can see how the school is doing. But most importantly, if a student is not at grade level for that time when they were tested, then there are programs that are in place, and we have, the Reading Corps works with students actually even in the preschool, and having those persons work. We have literacy aid that's available for school districts to use. In the allocation for the funds that the school district works with the principals and site-based teams, they can allocate additional funds for reading specialists. There's lots of persons employed as reading coaches now, and it's up to the district in terms of how they want to best meet that goal. In this year's Senate policy bill, we have a provision that says if you're not reading proficient, by the end of third grade. It will formally have a personalized learning plan put in place. This is new ground, and it's asking for the parent, the teacher, and the students to get on a program that's going to get you to proficiency. We understand there's a number of challenges that might have to be worked on, but it's so significant that you are proficient in reading, or you're going to have
reading is the basis of all learning after that point. That's how you acquire knowledge.
And so that's why we call that out at third grade, and we do have a provision in our policy bill, which just passed unanimously, and I want to thank Senator Pratt, who carried the bill, and I co-authored it, but it calls for that additional intervention, and it's saying there's an issue, a concern, an opportunity to put together a personalized learning plan, and that's what we have in place, and hopefully will pass.
Does any of these programs, proposed legislation, involve increased testing? There's been so much criticism of how much our kids are getting tested. Or does it work with the current system?
Yes, it would work within the system. We need to have better testing. I would argue there is too much testing right now, and we have a number of legislative proposals to address the testing issue. At not only President Obama, but at levels throughout the state. Governor Dayton and bipartisan legislators have said we need to get a better handle on testing, not the just testing to get a number, but is it transparent? Is it trustworthy? Is it going to help the student, the parent, the teacher? We've Education Minnesota, they came out with a number of great recommendations, and they're being sponsored by Senator Susan Kent in a bill which is largely embraced in our policy bill, which will provide information about the testing schedule, what's going to be done. It has whistleblower protections if someone complains about the system. We had a breakdown in the computer systems last year.
Yes, that was well publicized. Yes,
and there was large fines that were assessed, but sadly, teachers were saying, what good is this information anyway if we're going to get it months later? And in some cases, teachers aren't even aware of what the results were in this test, and the student may have been moved on or at a different school. And so we want to have a better handle on this in terms of the testing procedures that are being done. Senator Wickman has a bill with bipartisan authorship again, which would call for some innovation zones in testing. Bloomington School District and others are asking for this. There's No Child Left Behind was modified with the Every Student Succeeds Act, and this will encourage alternative testing. That still gets us at proficiency, but better ways of doing it. Senator Wickland has a bill which would encourage that. Another bill that we have time, I'll mention.
Just one more thing, yes.
Senator Jensen has a bill which would have the department study whether we could have a test at the secondary level that would say if you're college career ready. Perhaps it would be the ACT or the SAT, but a nationally normed test, and we could do that instead of the current Minnesota comprehensive test. Colleges don't really use that. They look at the ACT or the SAT, and so we're hoping we'll get better testing through the result in that.
Very good, Senator Wiger. I thank you so much for stopping by today.
Well, it's a pleasure. If anyone should have a question on what the committee is doing, if a suggestion, please give me a call.
You've been watching an interview with Senator Chuck Wiger on the DFL education priorities. I also had the opportunity to speak with the ranking minority member of the Education Committee, Senator Sean Nienow. Here's what he had to say. You spoke of empowering families and improving quality. I'd like to start with empowering families. What do you guys propose that could really empower families?
Well, they're currently in law. We do have some tax credits and tax deductions, but the scope of what those can be used for is relatively limited. One of the things we suggested is broadening that, not creating a new tax deduction, not creating a new tax credit, but broadening the use of the existing one and letting parents use that for tuition. So if they have a child that's in a school that's not working for them, which is very often the case, for example, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, fall, where we have children that are dropping out and failing out at record rates, they can look at the possibility of using that tax credit, that tax deduction for tuition at a private school. Another item that we would have created, proposed, was education savings accounts. Essentially what that would be is the use of the existing money we spend on that child, the state, letting the parents put that into essentially a savings account. It's like a health savings account, but for education. And being able to use that for their child, for the education that that child needs. But it would be targeted to two categories that everyone understands are problematic. One, special needs. And second, at-risk children that are in schools that are not performing at par. So failing schools and at-risk children.
So the education savings account is just for those two groups?
Targeted to those two categories. That would become a win-win. We've all seen the numbers, and I hate to pick on them, but this is where the numbers are the worst. Minneapolis and St. Paul, particularly when you look at the demographic difference between white and minority students, particularly between white and black or white and American Indian students. The results there are abysmal for those two minority categories. And giving them the option to look at other educational choices, private schools, charter schools, etc., helping them make that affordable. And then when you look at special needs, schools will tell you all day long that they are cross-subsidizing. And so if a family's in a school that they don't believe is meeting their children's special needs, they can use that money, go into a specialized program that works better for them, and the school actually would save money.
So the schools work on per pupil funding,
yes,
as I understand. So if those tax dollars then are being diverted to charter schools or something else, what are the implications for the public schools as they exist now?
Well, in the case of children with special needs, school districts will unanimously tell you they spend more money on a child with special needs than they're given. So they're cross-subsidizing. So if that child were to utilize the money that we allocate for that child to go into a private program, the school would actually be saving money. In the case of at-risk children in schools that are not succeeding, the school would lose that money, but the child is probably destined to failure, and I don't think that's an outcome that we would want.
Right. So you also talked about quality results. What do you mean by quality results?
Well, another proposal that we had was targeting third grade reading proficiency. And this is actually a provision that is going to be in the omnibus bill that is before the Education Committee this week. It would require that all students by third grade are reading at grade. And if not, the school has to create a plan to get them to reading proficiency. The problem we have is between first and third grade, you're learning to read. From third grade on, you're reading to learn. And if you can't read, if you're not proficient in reading, you're going to fall further and further and further behind, and it's going to get more and more expensive and more difficult to get that child educated, and they're not on a path for success at that point.
Right. So then what do you do with those third grade students that are not reading at grade level? What's the plan then?
Well, there's no specific mandate. That is allowed, that decision is left to the schools, and they are allowed to have some flexibility in determining what that needs to look like. It's not specifically spelled out. What is required is that they create a plan for that child.
Now, you also said that you would like to reinstate the graduation requirements. Do you know why they were removed in the first place?
Well, I could speculate. They were removed because there were more votes to remove them than there were to keep them. But there's been a lot of discussion around testing and things like that, and that was some of the argument. But the reality is the line that I like to use is when students go to school, they should learn things. And before we graduate them, we should know that they've retained what they've learned. And without those graduation standards, we don't know that. And the sad reality is that about 1 in every 3 children that go on to college, go on to higher education, not just 1 in 3 of every child, because not all children go to higher ed. Presumably the children that are going to higher education probably did a little better than children that are not. But 1 in 3 of those children going on to higher education need remedial classes, which means they can't read properly or they can't do math typically. One of those two categories. Those are 2 of the basics that we expect children to learn. You should be able to learn or read, and you should be able to do math before you graduate. But these children are going on to higher ed, going on to college, and 1 in 3 have to take remedial classes because they can't do it at the level they need to be doing it.
So does that mean that the graduation requirements would sort of set a bar so that then there would be kids who just don't graduate from high school?
Until they learn, unless there are mitigating circumstances. You know, if you have a child that has special needs, a child whose mental acuity is not typical, they may not be able to meet those standards, and there were provisions to allow for that. One anecdotal example of how this was making a difference before we repealed those laws, the gap between white and non-white students in math, for example, was horrendous. And when we implemented the graduation standard and said, you actually have to learn these things, the gap started to close. Now, I would say that's because we created an expectation and said, you will learn this. I don't care if you're black, blue, purple, or plaid, you can and you will learn this. That would be my explanation. Others would disagree, but when we created that standard and we started to apply it and said you need to learn this, that education gap started to close. And unfortunately then, we eliminated that grad standard.
So are you in favor at all of smaller class sizes or more tutoring? I mean, students have individual needs, there's different kinds of learners, and I think in the past there's been this moving people on, and that's why we kind of have this situation where kids aren't ready for college. They're going to college, but they're not quite ready for college. Class sizes are quite large. Is that something that the GOP is looking at also? Well,
you can have class sizes that are too large. And if you get past that point, you're going to have reduced results. But having a smaller class size in and of itself is not going to assure that you're going to have better results. So there's a sweet spot in that. And of course, we want to make sure that we're not getting beyond that. There's no question about that.
So are there any other education initiatives, maybe not for this session, but for the future that you and your party members are working on?
Well, I think we'll continue to look at those broad categories of empowering families, letting them have the option for educational choices that work best for them and for their children to get the best outcomes, looking at quality outcomes, ensuring that children, when they go to school, they learn. And before we graduate, we know that they've retained what they've learned and not just been able to pass a test on one day. And looking at those kinds of outcomes. Additionally, and we didn't touch on this, but another proposal that the GOP in the Senate put forth was to reduce some of the bureaucracy for schools, to have some reporting reduction. And that's actually another provision that's going to be in the omnibus bill that comes out this week and is going to get some discussion in the days to come. So we actually have had an influence and made a difference in what will probably be the final outcomes of this legislative session in education.
Senator Nienow, thank you for stopping by today.
Glad to be here.